In this unit, we're continuing our discussion from the last unit on writing. This is Chapter 12 in the Qualitative Research Methods textbook by Sarah Tracy in our Qualitative Research Methods class in Criminal Justice. The focus is on theorizing in writing, explaining, synthesizing, and crafting a tale. Here is the overview for Chapter 12. We're going to be discussing theorizing, brainstorming, and explaining. Then we get into the writing side of qualitative research with types of tales and the archaeology of a qualitative essay. Then we're going to cover different sections of your research papers with findings and analysis, conclusions, implications, limitations, and future research. The good news about writing qualitative research papers is that it occurs throughout the process of your research design, your data collection, and your analysis. Sometimes in the process of doing quantitative research, your writing will be broken up into stages. So first you might do a literature review, and then based on that literature review and your ideas, you come up with a survey or some other research instrument. So you might follow that up with a writing or part of your methods section. Then you send out your research instrument and wait for the data to come back to you. You analyze the data. In qualitative research, the process appears to be much more continuous, occurring throughout the research process. But in order for qualitative writing to be continuous, we have to start writing. Yes, you have to start the writing. Don't let yourself get in the way of doing good research. Don't be too critical on yourself. Your research won't be perfect, and that's okay, but your ideas are important, so just get to it. When I begin writing, I just begin. I always start with an outline, and then I do the lit review. So first up, we're talking about theorizing, brainstorming, and explaining. We've spoken of theory throughout the course, but just as a reminder, theory is a systematic explanation for the observed facts and laws that relate to a specific aspect of life or behavior. We use theory to help explain why things happen in the world or why an offender or individuals behave as they do. If our theory is well defined, we can use it to help predict what might happen in the future in similar settings. One of the hallmarks of scholarly research is that it provides a theoretical contribution. In other words, researchers hope to create, extend, or refine theory in the field that they are conducting research in. One of the direct benefits of theory for the researcher is that it helps you to see your data a new way. Maybe you're looking at the data you collected and it just doesn't make any sense to you. And you might ask yourself, why are these things happening like this? Theory can help make sense of what is happening, or maybe you look at an existing theory first, but you notice something else is happening in reality. So maybe you find an exception to the rule that others will find interesting. So for an example on how theory can help you see your findings in a new light, I suggest looking over exercise 12.1 on page 294. So how do we go about creating theory? Tracy tells us that we can use abduction, bracketing, and metaphor. Abduction is going into the field, consulting the literature, and then going back and forth between the two so that each helps each other. This is how you create and build theory. Tracy also mentions bracketing and metaphor as a means of creating theory. And again, if you look at exercise 12.2 on page 295, this exercise will help you theorize via bracketing, abduction, metaphor, and explaining. What is meant by bracketing is left a little unclear in the book, but if you take a look at Blackboard, I've included a short article that defines bracketing as the means by which researchers endeavor not to allow their assumptions to shape the data collection process, and the persistent effort not to impose their own understanding and constructions on the data. So clearly, bracketing has to do with self-reflexivity. If you get a chance, the article is only about 5 pages long, so just give it a glance. Again, Tracy mentions creating theory through metaphor, and this is exactly what it sounds like. Compare your situation, what you've observed to something else. So you'd say, this situation is like this. And finally, this slide mentions parameter setting. Parameter setting is a logical exercise that helps establish theoretical significance by using accessible in, or especially when language, to set parameters around your findings and claims. So in other words, my theory explains this phenomenon except when X occurs, but especially when Y occurs. Okay, so next up, we're going to move to the writing side of qualitative research. And we begin the discussion of writing by looking at types of tales. If you kept up with the reading, Tracy notes that Van Manen tales are a useful way to explore the multiple forms of representation found in qualitative research. These tales include realist and traditional, creative, impressionist, literary, confessional, and ethnographic, critical, and formal. When thinking about your own research, remember how you write affects what you write. Your style will affect everything from your findings to who reads your work and how they read your work. So begin by looking at the realist tale. The realist tale is the most common type of tale found in qualitative research, especially traditional or older research. In the realist tale, the author is largely absent. In other words, the author speaks as a narrator, but is not themselves found in the story. The realist tale includes a lot of detail, but writes in the third person voice that suggests that perspective is singular and universal. The singular and universal perspective means that competing interpretations are absent from the research. Just in terms of how they've written, realist tales use the present active tense. An example, the teacher asked the students, or the farmers plowed the fields. And realist tales use genetic types, such as instructor rather than the proper name Dr. Black, or wrestler rather than the proper name, like Randy Savage. As a critique, realist tales are said to lack self-reflexivity. So the author detaches himself or herself from their writing, which may also have the effect of allowing the writer to hide his or her biases. As a response to the singular and universal perspective found in realist tales, we have a crisis of representation. So the crisis of representation is about acknowledging the subjectivity of our research. It suggests that research can never represent an issue or set of participants authentically or holistically, and that every piece of research is only one part of the story. Research or tales following this tradition have been called many things, but Tracy prefers impressionistic and literary rather than experimental or messy. So let's start by discussing impressionist tales. Impressionist tales include the postmodern idea that reality is fractured and partial. Writers of impressionist tales use first-person voice. In other words, they put themselves in the story and might say that I observed and I interpreted. Again, the impressionist presumes that a singular tale can never provide the answer. Impressionist tales are considered successful when they open up the scene in important ways. In other words, they provide meaning in the scene, but not the only meaning. Impressionist tales focus squarely on the story and bring the reader along for the ride through the presentation of unique characters and creative literary techniques. As we discussed last unit, our qualitative research has to be interesting. It has to cut through the clutter. We are telling a story, so we have to consider what kinds of stories that we like to read or listen to or watch, and why those stories are so interesting to us. So there are a variety of interesting approaches that fall within this category of impressionist tales. And one approach to the impressionist tales are poetic inquiry, a method in which the author extracts keywords from the data and strategically truncates these words into poetic structures. As we've discussed at various points in the book, this might not be a form that's available to us as scholars of criminal justice or law, but we don't know if the style of writing is totally closed off to us. If this is something that you think you would be good at, then, go ahead and try it. So let's move on to confessional tales. In the confessional tale, the researcher's story takes center stage. Confessional tales sometimes accompany other types of tales they've written so that researchers know exactly how the author comes to conclusions. These tales are interesting when there is something significant or unique to confess. So, for example, Van Manen used one of the examples from the book that he was denied access 14 times before he got into a study at the police department. These tales include motivations, mistakes, and what happens backstage. And I can tell you personally that some of the most interesting and rewarding lessons to take away from conducting research are found in the process of actually doing the research. So with confessional tales, you're providing a story within a story. You, the author, are the main character, and as such, the writing is done using first-person voice. A related type of tale is the autoethnography, and autoethnographies have some similarities with confessional tales. The author tends to highlight his or her role in the research, and they tend to focus more on the hidden or the shameful parts of life. Also, autoethnographies usually shed light on issues outside of the author or theoretical contributions. Autoethnographies fix the confessions with the narrative methods of impressionist tales. For both of these types of tales, the author often refers to dialogue that actually took place. For more on the use of dialogue, see the Researcher's Notepad 12.2 on page 302. Finally, Van Manen also discusses a host of other types of tales. Critical tales shed light on social and political issues. Formal tales lay theories on top of the text, so be sure and check out the exercise 12.3, the accidental rewrites, that's on page 303. And this asks the researcher to rewrite some of their existing word. And just in case you hear all that panting, that is my old Labrador. She's in my office with me most of the time. So next up is the archaeology of the qualitative essay. Tracy describes the typical format of a 15 to 35 page qualitative essay that could serve as a book chapter, a journal article, a class paper, or even a conference submission. In particularly, Tracy focuses on the methods, findings and analysis, and conclusions and implications. For more on some of the earlier sections of a research paper, flip back to chapter 4, where those sections were originally covered. But you see here that we start at the beginning of any good research paper. It's the writing of the framing material, and this includes the title, abstract, and keywords. Researchers should take care in writing these sections. Now, why? Because these are the elements of a paper that tell potential readers right away if they should stick around or not. For instance, the abstract. How many times when you're looking for an article yourself that the only thing you read is the abstract? Now, and the keywords should be inviting. Tracy suggests writing the abstract before writing the paper, and this helps guide the study. But you are going to modify it later as needed. What happens many times in research when you're sending in your IRB application or even submitting a paper for a conference, you will submit your abstract, and you may do this before you even write the paper or finish the study. So you will need to go back and make the changes in your abstract to explain what you found in your research. So good abstracts are clear and concise and avoid the jargon. They should describe the story or research and what it's about. They should provide the rationale for the story, and they should be written with an intended audience in mind. They should connect to a larger scholarly conversation in our field of study. If we can successfully insert ourselves into a larger academic conversation, others will actually cite our work. And just think about how cool it would be to see your name on someone else's paper. So next, let's talk about writing the introduction, the literature review, and conceptual framework. When you first started the research process, you probably wrote a research proposal, as I was saying, perhaps for the IRB. So for the final version of your paper, you don't just copy the research proposal, because many issues will have changed since that time. With the introduction, you should set the tone for the piece and encourage interest from the reader. The first section should also invite key readers, also known as the conceptual cocktail party. The introductory material may also foreshadow the ways the study will contribute to the current literature. So before moving on to talk about the literature review, I want to make a special note about missing gaps in literature in your introduction. And this is discussed by Tracy on page 305. She notes that we shouldn't do what most other articles do by just stating that we are writing because no one else has written on our topic before. This might not be true. We might not have found that similar writing does in fact exist. It could be there's a study that was completed, but that we just did not find it. Further, it may be that there's a reason that no one has written about the topic before. Maybe the topic is just too difficult to tackle. Maybe it's too broad. Also, we may be expanding on prior research or redoing a study because times have changed and policies have changed. I agree with Tracy that the introduction should be revisited often. In fact, I suggest writing the introduction last, especially after you've completed the lit review. Then go back and add the focus of the study and how you studied the material, and the material that's in the methods. This is always in present tense. Do not say in your introduction, this study will show, because at this point your study's already done. So say this study shows this. So moving on to the lit review. The literature review should clearly define and explain the key concepts related to the findings as found in the literature. Including the lit review in qualitative research is probably a little bit more tricky than it would be in quantitative research. In qualitative research, you're probably going to find that you have less room for a detailed lit review. You may even need to work the lit review into the larger body of work, as we've said before. The style or format that you choose is going to dictate a lot about how your work is presented. So next up is writing the research methodology and methods sections of your paper. This section details the techniques used to collect, organize, and analyze the data. In other words, how did you do what you did? In your paper for this class, this is going to be in future tense because this is a proposal for the. In other words, this is what I will do, and this is why I am going to do this. The importance of this section is that you want other people to be able to come along later and duplicate your work as nearly as possible. If others can duplicate your efforts, they can test your results and then build on the findings and possibly even the theory that you've created. And this is very flattering. This is something you can do from other research as well to see if your findings are similar to a prior research study. Being descriptive about what you've actually done is being transparent. Now there's a difference between a methodology and methods that we need to cover. When we refer to methodology, we're talking about the philosophical approach taken. So, for example, an interpretive approach. While the methods refers to the techniques used to collect, organize, and analyze the data, some researchers label this section methods or research methods, while others use a more creative or maybe content-based title. My preference is to refer to this section as the research methods section, so that your reader knows exactly what you're getting into. The final method section should include what was detailed previously in Chapter 5, along with a transparent explanation of the actual data collected and the procedures that you used for analyzing your data. As I said, for your project in this class, this is a proposal of what you will do. How will you analyze this data? So I suggest seeing Researcher's Notepad 12.3 on page 307 for example tables that really show how to sum up data collection. The methods section should also explain how the interviews were conducted, so in this paper, how they will be conducted, how field notes were collected and recorded, and how data was organized. The methods section should also include examples of first and second level codes and excerpts from the code book. The methods section sometimes end up significantly cut in the editorial process, but it's always best to include details up front so you don't skimp on the methods section. You can always go back and delete things later. So let's move down to writing the findings and analysis section. This is the section where you tell the reader what you found and what you think it means. This section of your paper should be persuasive in order to maximize the ability of your research to persuade. Consider front-loading the findings and consider the good all 4 C's like conflict, connection, continuing, curiosity, and climatic satisfaction. Conflict means that your research should identify and explain problems or controversies. Connection means that your research should identify with the reader through character development. Continuing curiosity means that your research should be novel and include plot development. In other words, is your work a page turner? And finally, climatic satisfaction asks the question, does the ending deliver? Does this paper do what it says it does? It's just like the conclusion of HBO's Game of Thrones, where it left many feeling empty inside. So now for the next set of slides, we'll briefly go over the 6 strategies for organizing findings. Themes or topics from chronology or natural history, convergent or braided narrative, the puzzle or explanation strategy, separated narratives, and messy or layered text. The first organization strategy for your findings is by themes or topics. This strategy organizes your findings around several primary themes, which are your topics. The themes may just emerge as relevant when you're reviewing your data, or the themes may come from already established theory. If you find a good system of organization from existing research, why not use it? There's no reason to reinvent the wheel every time that you write. Our next strategy is the chronology or life story. And this organizes findings in relation to time. A chronology narrates the development of a certain process over time. A life story tells the story of a certain person or group of people over time. The chronology or life story strategy is common for use with discourse tracing. You'll recall back in chapter 10 that discourse tracing is a method designed for qualitative researchers who want to critically analyze data from multiple structural levels to the micro, meso, and macro, and how events or situations will change over time. This strategy highlights movement or change and describes why something progressed in a specific manner. In other words, chronology or life story is a time-based story of change. If no change is occurring, then the style of organization might not be a good way to organize your findings. Next, we have convergence or braided narrative as a means for organizing your findings. With this strategy, 2 or more stories overlap and parallel each other to illustrate a larger story. If you're a film buff at all, this is how you might describe Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction. Several storylines are running at the same time, and sometimes they're intersecting with one another. In your research, you might also weave together a variety of stories featuring characters, including yourself, to describe and explain phenomenon. But this is really important to consider here, this type of writing takes up more space and is usually evidence of longer forms of publications, such as books, rather than a shorter form of writing, such as an article or a book chapter. And because there are so many moving parts to consider and manipulate, this technique takes significant literary handwriting expertise, which I know everyone in this class has. Next up, we have the puzzle or explication strategy, which opens with a puzzle, enigma, or paradox. And this style provokes curiosity in the reader, and it should explain why something occurred, or at least give us clues to help us solve the puzzle for ourselves. As noted by Tracy, she used this style in her dissertation to explain the puzzling performances of correctional officers. The next strategy for organizing our findings is the separated text. With the separated text, the analysis and theoretical information are separated from a more descriptive story. You can read more about this style on pages 310 and 311 in Tracy's textbook. This approach employs very little jargon or scholarly language, and researchers separate the text for aesthetic or practical reasons. The technique is valuable for researchers interested in reaching multiple audiences. Some people will only watch or read about the substantive contribution of your research. In other words, what you experience. Others will only want to read about your theory and findings. So separating text basically allows the reader to neatly skip around in your work to find what they are looking for. And this approach is also very common when writing case studies. And finally, we have the layered or messy text. This strategy juxtaposes time periods and topics to create ruptures and hijack reader assumptions. Sometimes this is accomplished through visual cues, such as a series of asterisks. These texts may seem easy to write, but fitting together the pieces can sometimes be difficult. So reflecting now on all of these strategies, I would suggest exercise 12.4 on page 312 to really help you determine which writing strategy that you will use in your own paper. We have just 2 more slides. We talk next about writing the conclusion and implication section. Start with a summary. The best summaries are specific and high in content. They synthesize rather than just summarize the findings. Conclusions should not only be summarized, but they should reveal how the study extends existing knowledge. Ask the question, what do researchers know after finishing your paper that they didn't know before reading your paper? So, for example, Red's airport security research added the new concept of emotional taxes. The conclusion should also point out that applications to practice. Researchers need to explain how the research applies and helps the day-to-day lives of the participants. Conclusions should also include a discussion of the study's limitations. No research study is perfect. There are limitations to every research. The limitations should be discussed in the transparent and vulnerable manner. The conclusion should also be heuristic by pointing to directions for future research. In both of these concepts, limitations and future research may usefully be coupled together. So readers should feel convinced that the study reached its goal after reading the final sentence of your paper. And remember, you want your research to be transparent. Okay, here's our last slide, and I have some party thoughts. The traditional writing format assumes that a qualitative paper is like writing a 4-act play, but not all studies follow this traditional format. A traditional style can be problematic because it suggests a myth of deduction, and this format presents qualitative research as linear, when in fact it may be circular and in most often is inductive. Forcing the 4-act writing format can harm qualitative epistemology and the pedagogy. It can harm the epistemology because it hides the way knowledge is actually acquired, and it can harm the pedagogy because it hides the process of actual data collection and the author's emic processes. Tracy discusses an example of her first research project on a cruise ship. She was asked by the journal editor to create research questions after she had completed the analysis. This request created the illusion that she knew her questions beforehand and then sought out the data to answer those questions, when in fact this was not the case at all. So in other situations, Tracy tried to write layered accounts with co-authors, but editors rejected the piece or they asked for revisions. So no matter how you decide to write your qualitative piece, you need to understand that it is difficult. And providing writing advice for qualitative researchers is also difficult and paradoxical. Following the traditional writing format can be pragmatic. However, over time, many qualitative scholars have displayed the courage and tenacity to forge change in publication expectations. So as you see here on this slide, a conclusion exercise for you to do. And it says, so in a study of your topic, then your last name and year, and what you found. You found that you summarized the findings in just a few phrases. So for me, in a study of recorded presentations, I might say, well, Black found that by slide 12, students started to zone out. So that might be a way that I can summarize a paper that I would write about recording lectures. You ought to be able to write this type of statement for anything that you write and from papers that you read. So this is actually a good starting point for writing your literature review. That is all for this unit. Just to summarize, the chapter helped hopefully to explain how qualitative is greatly connected to the larger theoretical conversations and the different ways to present qualitative research, as well as the key sections of a research paper. Please post any of your questions in regards to this in the virtual hours so that everyone can see.